well. Halloween horror or breathing space. The EU has given the UK 6 months until the next Brexit deadline. The will they, won't they roller coaster continues. So I'm delighted that former Taoiseach and EU Ambassador to Washington, John Bruton, has joined us in studio this Sunday. And John Bruton, first of all, the first question, do you think that the UK is now going to be taking part in the European Parliament elections?
Yes, I do. Obviously, the Conservative Party in particular would like not to, but I think it's doubtful if they will reach an agreement with Labour in time to avoid either the European elections taking place in Britain or a crash-out Brexit if they don't on the 1st of June.
And does that mean that this vote becomes the effective Brexit referendum?
Well, the European Parliament elections will be fought on proportional representation. So that will allow, I think, more easily than the usual British electoral system does, for the emergence of a middle ground on the Brexit issue and on Britain's future more generally in its relations with Europe. I'm hoping that all of those 6 million people, for example, who signed a petition, that they'll make sure to vote. And if there is a high poll in the European Parliament elections, a higher poll than previous ones, which wouldn't be too difficult to achieve, and there's a significant level of support for parties supporting Remain, then there might be a possibility that that would build a momentum which would enable the whole issue to be reconsidered. But if people don't vote, or if people who are highly in favour of Brexit get the most seats, well, then it sets the dynamic in another direction. It is a form of consultation with the people.
And what's been really interesting since the European Council meeting and this 6-month extension, from the UK end, there's almost a perception that, you know, these extensions could roll on and on and on and on and on. On the other hand, from Brussels and other European capitals, more and more reporting that ultimately the EU 27 are getting so fed up with this, they really do want the UK out. How worried should we be about that train of thought?
I think we should be very worried about it, because there is a perception in many European countries that any time Britain gets a concession, it pockets it and goes on making its next request. They were exempted from the euro, exempted from justice and home affairs. They got a deal in relation to social welfare rights for immigrants in David Cameron's negotiation. But at no stage did the British politicians trumpet these achievements and say that that's a basis for supporting continued membership of the European Union. They simply brushed them aside and moved on to the next demand. And I think there is a fear in other countries in Europe, which obviously would affect us very much, that Britain in the EU will never, ever settle down. So I think, in a way, Britain needs to convince the rest of Europe that if it does decide to remain, that it's going to remain as an enthusiastic supporter of the European Union and not as a drag on the European Union.
And at the moment, there's very little sign of that. So how worried should we be about this better if they're gone sentiment within the EU?
I think we must do everything we can to fight against that. I think we must come forward with suggestions as to how Britain, if it does leave, which I think is the most likely outcome, is kept in close association with the European Union. One suggestion has been made that there could be something like a European Customs Association, which would be consulted by the EU in regard to trade policy, even though the EU would remain in full charge of it, and that Britain might be in that would mitigate the sense of Britain being affected by EU decisions but having no say in them. Other creative ideas like that should be supported, I think, to ensure that no matter what happens, Britain isn't isolated. Because the last thing we want to see is a British government, either led by Boris Johnson, adopting a very anti-EU, pro-American line, or a British government led by Jeremy Corbyn taking a very anti-EU, pro-China, pro-Russia line. And Ireland then becomes a front line, so to speak, in a global struggle. And that's never a comfortable place to be. So we must do everything we can to mitigate this divergence. The truth is, Brexit is not going to be a destination. Brexit is going to be a process that's going to go on and on and on. And either Britain will be progressively diverging further and further away from the EU, or remaining close to the EU. And we've got to try and make sure that whatever happens, they remain close.
You know how Europe works. Behind all the fine words, how much pressure are we under in terms of a hard border and the being the front line, the frontier of the single European market?
Well, I think you've got to look at the law. The EU Customs Code is, I think, quite explicit, and nobody has suggested yet that it's going to be amended, and we will have to apply the EU Customs Code. Now, that does, in regard to food and animal products, require that there be inspections before anything enters EU territory to ensure that the food or animal products are safe. In regard to goods, they can perhaps be inspected somewhere else other than at the border. But the big problem with Brexit is not really about goods. It's divergence of standards, divergence of professional qualifications, divergence in all sorts of norms that at the moment are the same north and south and enable us to operate one economy to a degree on the island of Ireland. If Northern Ireland is dragged away from the European Union standards by British decisions, that will progressively make the gulf between the two parts of Ireland deeper. And that, of course, will be contrary to the framework agreement, which John Major and I negotiated, and more importantly to the Good Friday Agreement, which is an international treaty and was endorsed in a referenda north and south.
So, given those risks, is there not some kind of argument for a poll that would give the people of Northern Ireland who voted to remain in the EU, who voted to back the Good Friday Agreement, to give them a say again?
Yes, there would, but it would depend on how it is framed and how it is perceived. If it was perceived as something that was going to change the constitutional status of Northern Ireland and mitigate its link with Britain, that would, I think, be seen very badly in significant sections of unionist opinion. Now, the polls that we've seen suggested, one done last November, suggested that if Britain were to remain in the EU, the overwhelming majority in Northern Ireland are quite happy to stay in the UK. If the May's deal goes through, it's about 50-50. If there's a no-deal Brexit, there's a significant majority for leaving the UK and joining the EU via Ireland. That shows that there's a big middle ground opinion in Northern Ireland, which could go either way. But I'm not so sure we're prepared for that. I'm not so sure that we've thought through the security implications of that, which could be very substantial and very disruptive. Nor have we thought through the financial implications. Remember, 25% of Northern Ireland's GDP is the subsidy it gets for public services from the island of Britain. Who would replace that? And where would the money come from? These are questions that need to be addressed.
So it's a question of not doing whatever, if there is ever a poll or whatever the question would be, it's a question of not doing what they did with Brexit, simply putting a divisive question before people without, as Donald Tusk said, having a plan for
Absolutely,
afterwards.
that's 100% correct. These binary questions never really represent the full complexity of these issues. I think we should be not looking at that at all. We should be looking at a process of helping Unionists to feel more comfortable in their relationship with Dublin. That should be our goal. And in that way, bring them around to a situation that whatever the constitutional outcome or the status of Northern Ireland, that everybody, nationalists and unionists, will be comfortable with the outcome. We can't just carry this or anything like it by a narrow majority, leaving a deeply alienated minority.
One of the things that has made all the negotiations around Brexit so difficult between the UK and Europe has been this question of freedom of movement. And as we've seen, you know, the rise of populism and the Brexit parties in the UK, we've seen that populist, nativist kind of politics emerging right across Europe. What's gone wrong, and why is that happening in your view?
I don't think it's much or particularly to do with migration. I think the populist alienation arises from a widening gap between those who are seen to be on the inside track as far as decision making is concerned, those who live in capital cities all over the world, and the rest of the community who feel, perhaps wrongly, that they're not being listened to. They are being listened to, but they don't feel they're being listened to. And I think that's a problem for democratic politics.
Because there's a lot of, in Italy, Austria, Spain,
yes,
right across Europe. And they're saying, Europe's not getting us. Europe's not listening to us. Europe needs to change.
And it's added to by social media, who magnify these discontents. But I think, unfortunately, the big mistake that Britain made was to say that they were concerned about EU immigration. because that excluded them from the single market. And the single market is a British creation, something that has been a great success, the deepest and most integrated single market in the world, involving numerous countries. And the British are leaving that, which is hugely beneficial to them. 80% of their exports are services, simply because of an immigration problem that is a non-problem. There aren't enough Poles left in Poland to continue the rate of westward migration from Poland that there was 10, 15 years ago. That's all drying up now. In fact, Britain needs EU immigrants more now than it ever needed them. And yet, because of concerns it had in 2016 about migration, it has backed itself into this cul-de-sac.
So how do you see the next 6 months? Look into the crystal ball. I mean, it's impossible, I know, but your best guesstimate as to how the next 6 months are going to go?
I think it will all depend on the incentives. Labour have different incentives to the Conservative Party. I think Labour would not want a quick deal, because they want to get the benefits from the local elections and the European elections.
And the polls look to be going their way at the moment.
So I don't think they'll get a quick deal. However, I think when they get down to it, and if they do make a negotiation, they'll have two problems. One, working out the detail. Two, making sure that any deal they make between them can't be reversed by another Tory leader or another Prime Minister of another government. And the only way, I think, of copper fastening any new deal to ensure that it can't be changed by a subsequent government is to have a second referendum. So I think the referendum potentially offers a solution to the problem of how do you build trust between the two major parties.
And can you see two weary political parties finally coming around to that point of view because Parliament simply isn't able to sort this problem out by itself?
Truthfully, I cannot see that at the moment from what I'm watching in Westminster, but you never know. I mean, maybe this holiday, the Easter holiday, we'll see some spiritual guidance.
Yeah, a bit of chocolate. Finally, just one final question for you. One of the hardest calls that Taoiseach ever has to make is when to call the general election. There is a breathing space now. So, you know, the rumours are rife around Leinster House again. Just, you're a man who's had to make that call. Any advice?
No. I think those calls are impossible. And for certain, whatever call you make, there'll be some people who'll say it was the wrong one afterwards. So
all right,
you just go with your instinct, whatever that is.
All right. John Bruton, thank you very much indeed.